Excellent. Hi, everyone. Just want to thank Lisa and the organisers for the opportunity of being able to speak here today. Feels pretty weird being at a conference again after all these months. And good to see everyone here. So today I was going to cover off a few different topics. I think all under the banner of sort of digital design and trying to get customer-centric design as an integral part of the way you approach technical development. And this will be against the backdrop of the Inland Revenue Transformational Program, which has been ongoing for about 4 years now. It's still got about another year and a half to run. So I'll run through that. I think what I'm going to speak about is some of the practices that we've applied, some of the learnings and failures we've had in that process, and then sort of where we sort of settled now, and in terms of practice and process and how we've got to that point. For us, it's been a massive learning process, and I just suppose just a journey of continuous improvements in a way. So look, I'll kick off. Have I got a zapper? Yes, I have. It says next. So I thought I'd start with a bit about inland revenue. So most of you have intimate knowledge of inland revenue in one way or another, I presume. Been there about 4 years myself. It's a bit of a conversation killer when you're at the barbecue and you mention that you're working for Inland Revenue. I'll get over it at some point. I suppose one of the first things to call out about Inland Revenue is the fact that it's actually got two really big sides to the organisation. Everyone's familiar with the get money side. We get close to 80 billion worth of revenue for the state into Inland Revenue every year. But we've also got a very important give money side to the organisation. And these are two very, very different customer propositions that are managed under one roof, in effect. And interestingly enough, the $4 billion of money that we dispense actually has a far higher operational burden associated with it than the money that we get in. Proportionately. So if you look at all the inbound calls we get every year, we get close to 3 million inbound calls. More than 40% of those calls are actually on the give money side of the equation. And that's just due to the customer base on that side just needing more immediate attention, needing more assurance, and needing sort of more understanding of how they can navigate through quite difficult situations often. So the social policy product side, working for families, child support, student loan, and even to some extent KiwiSaver, are actually quite dominant parts of the operational base of the business, despite looking smaller on the monetary side. Interesting for us in doing the digital developments and sort of trying to transform the digital channels, this sort of schizophrenic nature, if you'd like, of Inland Revenues is quite a challenging proposition, because customers manifest themselves really differently across these two parts of the spectrum. Although it's all tied at the end of the day in your tax position. So so just moving on from that and having a look at sort of the transformation program. A while back, and this was probably close to 6 years ago, it was realised that the core system that we had, which was nearly 20 years old, just wasn't doing the job anymore for us. When child support was implemented off the back of the legislation being passed, it was a massive undertaking by Inland Revenue, and it really it cost a lot of money. It was exceptionally difficult, and it was realised at that point in time that sort of the flexibility that the tax system needed just wasn't there anymore. So in conjunction with thinking about replacing the core tax system, the organisation took a big thought about what should we be doing at large to transform the organisation. And nearly 2 years of strategy work was done under the banner of IR for the future. A completely revised strategy was formulated, and that strategy became the backbone of the transformational program, which has been put into place since then. So if you look at the objectives there, three transformational pillars that the transformation would lead Inland Revenues becoming a customer-centric organisation with the customer at the heart of everything we did and the way we approach things. Furthermore, we would be intelligence-led. Inland Revenue sits on a lot of data, but we, like everyone else, face into this massive challenge of having to take an abundance of data and turning it into an abundance of insight, which you can use to leverage in how you deal with your customers and manage your position. And thirdly, and sort of very importantly, given what we were coming from, business agility was seen as exceptionally important. Inland revenue needs to be able to flex with the governments. It needs to be able to adapt to policy and legislative change. It needs to be able to do so quickly and effectively. So without the business agility, we really, it just don't cuss the mustard, basically. So I think in that sort of, in terms of setting up the benefits for the program, there were three really big drivers. The first is, of course, trying to grow compliance levels. Growing compliance levels means more money in without us having to chase it necessarily. At the same time, the whole cost to serve equation is essential for us. And cost to serve is not purely an internal operational consideration. It's the cost of compliance in the tax ecosystem at large as well. So it's how much customer effort needs to be expended to stay compliant or to access your entitlements. So those are two really dominant points for us. And of course, the last point is just this whole flex point. We need to be able to shift and change as the government demands of us. So those were the transformational objectives. And they ended up being spun into a program which has so many different arms and legs, basically. So the program is vast. It runs for 6 years. I think it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, government-funded initiative in absolute ages. I think $1.4 to $1.5 billion of funding over a 5 to 6 year period. And it really touches every aspect of the business. So if you look at the different components on there, you've got the replacement of the core system on the one side. You've got the replacement of the insights backbone of the business, our data warehouses and the platform that we analyze on the back of that. You've got the reorganization of the business itself and our operating model. In addition to that, you've got the introduction of Intelligent Workplace, which is us getting onto different devices with different software so we can collaborate and work remotely across quite a sprawling organization. We're also changing the back office system. So we had SAP that we're moving away from SAP as our financial management system. And we're now into the world of Oracle as a back office system. And sort of there's nearly no aspects of the business which is left untouched in effect through all of this. Have I missed any of those legs? Perhaps the most important, policy. In inland revenue, policy is product in a way. The policies we decide become the tax products like income tax and GST, and the way you shape them is it's all a policy construct. The reason policy is so important in this transformational program is it's through policy and policy change that you get simplicity in product, and simplicity of product is the main driver for compliance. Complex tax products give low levels of compliance ultimately, so you need to make simplistic products with simplistic rule sets. So policies are massive for us. The bit I represent there is just that little piece to the right, I think, yeah, the digital enterprise pieces. So there's a sub-program within the program which is there to actually drive the transformation of our digital channels. So taking on this challenge and acknowledging sort of like the give and the get equation, and also acknowledging the fact that we're going to be changing the whole business, the policy base that we stood upon, and our digital channels, we needed to latch onto something to sort of to be true to the transformational pillar of being customer-centric. So I suppose we, like everyone else, looked at the basic service design concepts of customer journeys and started digging into those across the customer base. And I suppose it's at that point that the reality of what we were taking on really dawned upon us, because inland revenue has in effect got 8 million customers. It's every individual in this country, but it's also every entity of different shapes, sizes, and forms. They're all different. They all do different things. They use different products in different ways, and they use our different channels in different ways. And we got into the whole sort of journey mapping thing using the good old infinity loop and started looking at that aspect of the whole thing. But it very soon became apparent that it wasn't really that cool because the thing is we're just a small component in people's lives, and there's life events all around that are sort of tangled together with what we're doing, and sort of it was very apparent that whatever customer journey maps we put into place were sort of in a way deficient. But we had to acknowledge that, and we had to go through the exercise, and we had to lay that foundation. It sort of got even worse when when you sort of looked at the ecosystem. This is a simple depiction of the ecosystem around student loans. And with that comes another realization as well, that inland revenue, whilst we might think we're the center of the universe when it comes to tax and social policy products, we're actually just a bit player in effect. We have an enormous dependence on sort of other partners, providers, suppliers in a massive ecosystem of players. When it comes to student loan, there are just so many different players around us, and that includes, for example, the likes of debt collection agencies in foreign countries, where we're trying to chase down student loans, because typically when anyone leaves New Zealand, not anyone, I won't generalize, but when a lot of people leave New Zealand, sort of their last concern is paying off their student loan, so we need to go to great lengths sometimes to get that money back. So we've got interfaces and we've got connections with debt collection agencies in other countries just to try and recoup some of that money, which is, by the way, the New Zealand government's largest debt, if I understand it correctly. So look, I think in the setup phases, this whole process was quite intimidating for us. We were given the very simple task of make the channels better, make it easier for customers to interact with us and stay compliant and get access to the entitlements. But when we started digging under the hood, it became apparent that it was very, very complex. And I think the more we dug into it, the more we realized that we could not do it by ourselves. We really need to leverage the broader system of players that are part of the tax system. So in the end, the sort of banner that we started operating under was one of evolving our digital ecosystem, rather than just changing our own digital channels. And it sort of became a game of two halves, if you like. We had sort of the notion of being digital by default. People should be able to self-serve unless they're in a very complex situation, and they should be able to use digital channels to do nearly everything associated with tax and social policy products. We had to lower the barriers of entry and drive sort of uptake of digital channels. And we are really seeing some good effects on these side. We've seen digital uptake of our authenticated channels sort of lift from 2.8 million registered users to 3.8 million in the last 3 years. So we're getting cut through on these things by lowering barriers of entry. But at the same time, sort of this channel shift was not only a channel shift to our own channels, we also wanted to empower and enable other players in the environment to do right by our customers. And the notion that we latched onto this was one of natural systems thinking. If I'm managing my financial affairs as a small business, I might be doing it in a software package, such as the well-known packages like Xero, MYOB. Why not make tax an integral part of managing your financial situation? Because that's quite simply what you're doing anyway. So the notion of people being able to file for GST, file for income tax, or access information we hold on them through their financial management software packages became absolutely integral to the way we think. And this led us to the second leg of digital development, which became the larger leg, which was actually our B2B interfaces and the way we connect with the ecosystem. So from starting off with a notion of a very webby sort of program where we'd re-engineer www.ild and we'd change MyIR. It really became, yes, we're going to do all that stuff, but equally as important, in fact, if not more importantly in some cases, we're actually going to sort of create a whole set of interfaces that we can expose the tax system, its business rules, the data we hold to trusted parties in an ecosystem. And those trusted parties are going to work to make things better for their customers and to make tax simpler and integrated. And the whole idea behind this is that we really want to try and make tax as invisible as possible for people. We've got a long way to go, admittedly, but no one's going to not feel the pain of money going to the tax agency. But anyway, the notion is actually getting it out there. So I think this game of two halves became sort of the digital program in a way. That's been running now for around about 4 years. And I think just moving on from that as well, that was the first sort of split that we saw. And once we worked that out and we started structuring ourselves around those pieces of work, the path forward became more apparent for us. The next big thing, though, became like setting ourselves up for getting it right and really applying this customer-centric approach within the way we developed. Inland Revenue's got some absolutely awesome research capability within the organisation, and they embarked on a piece of work which ran under the banner of the segment landscapes. We cut the customer base into 5 segments. If you recall the little diagram, there was a component of the diagram which was organisational design and change. Inland Revenue sort of flicked its whole structure 90 degrees and went from a product-centric focus to a customer-centric focus, and it reorganised itself around these 5 fundamental customer segments. And then in conjunction with that, we spun up these segment landscape documents. And they're really exceptional pieces of work. They explain the exact demographics, nature, behaviour, drivers, and values of each of our major customer segments. It breaks it down into customer segments. It explains the major life events, the customer journeys they're on, and the dependencies they have on natural system players. And that became a very foundational piece of work for what we were doing. At the same time, the policy engine spun up and started simplifying as best they could the tax and social policy products that we have. You've probably all seen the changes that we've put into place around tax on income, where we automatically calculate tax on income every year instead of asking people to sort of self-declare and provide us with information. And those were all parts of a simplification play, right? Just trying to make tax more automatic for people. That led to a set of product strategies, and in the mashup between these products and segment strategies, we generated segment roadmaps which explained how we were going to sort of better serve each of these customer segments. That became scope, and then we had to deliver on scope. And getting into the delivery game was on the one side about actually spinning up customer-centric practices in how we develop each of these channels, but on the other side, really understanding the quantum of change and the nature of change that we'd be pushing out into our customer base and the ecosystem so we could manage it. And that's a point that we've taken exceptionally seriously. We realized that this transformational program, if it's going to have effect, is not just about changing the way we operate, it's about changing the way people interact with the tax system and how different partners interact with us so they can better support customers. In order to do that, you have to invest quite heavily. You have to understand who you're dealing with, you have to understand the change impact, you have to understand what treatments you can apply to each of the segments based on the impact, and then you really have to be able to follow through with that and deliver on it. So the sort of the interplay between the customer-centric design and sort of the customer awareness and readiness pieces were essential for us. And then we tried to close the loop by making sure that we were well tuned to the voice of the customer in the whole thing, and that if we did get it wrong, we adjusted, responded, and changed direction. And we've had the privilege of being able to do so because it's a multi-year program. If you're running a shorter-term development piece, that's not the case. You've got to do as best you can, learn, move on to the next big thing. But we have had the luxury, if you'd like, of multiple large releases over many years. So I think, and then on top of it all, sort of like this interplay, I suppose, between digitising the ecosystem on the one side and transforming our organisation on the other side. But an exceptional amount of work was put into getting these foundational elements laid up, and I can't underemphasize the importance of setting a good contextual understanding as the basis for good design and good development. Without that stuff, you end up running on a massive assumption base. And the one thing that we've discovered in an organization with lots and lots of smart people is that we think we know who our customers are and what they want, but we actually have no idea. And that's been hammered home to us time and time again. The assumption base you start with when it comes to customers is invariably wrong. And a lot of this research work really proved it. The big thing, though, that makes it hard is once you've done this groundwork, get the understanding, you then have to find a way of incorporating that understanding in the design processes so that you can challenge the assumption base. And that's hard as well, because people fall back into the comfort zone of what they assume and they know. And they're not necessarily open to understanding and learning as they need to be. And that's more, how would I put it? It's a culture thing that will vary from organisation to organisation. part of Inland Revenue as well, being quite a sort of a legally oriented company with a lot of accountants in it and things like that, is there's this desire to be absolutely correct as well. And the challenge with being absolutely correct is that you can very often end up designing for fringe cases, because there's always someone that's in sort of way out here on the fringes of design that's quite nominal, but that someone will believe is quite important. And when you start designing digital solutions and you're overly accommodating for all these fringe cases, you lose simplicity, and quite simply you end up with bad design in the interfaces. And the big counter that you need for that is the strong understanding of the customer base and where the majority of users lie and what the majority of users need, rather than what the fringe case needs, because you have to have discussions about, what would I call it, sort of the weighting of these different components in design. Yeah. So anyway, so I think sort of setting up a framework like this is important, because it gives you the opportunity of challenging assumptions, it gives you the opportunity of changing culture, and most importantly, it gives you the opportunity of flicking from an inside-out mentality to an outside-in mentality, which is fundamentally challenging for any organization. Really, really difficult. So I've sort of like highlighted customer-centric design, because that's some of the stuff I'm going to touch on now is in that. But I'd really like to emphasize that all these elements, they are actually part of our customer-centric design process, not just that particular block, which is the practices that we deployed in these particular channels. So then just flicking on from that, another thing that became really apparent to us is like a lot of people that we pulled into the digital team had service design backgrounds, and we had some really good service design partners, but it became very apparent very quickly that out of the box vanilla service design just doesn't cut it always. You've really got to adapt, and you've got to adapt based on the particular system that you're trying to adapt, the set of users there, and the development process that's deployed there. So for example, when we're designing dubs, it's entirely at our discretion. We've got a new content management system. We do as we please with it. We decide what development pace we're going to have, and it's totally discretionary. If we decide to put something in there, we put it in there. When it comes to MyIR, which is our authenticated channel, different story. We were the COTS supplier. That COTS supplier has an off-the-shelf piece of software with a set of design patterns that it supports, and a set of configurations that it supports. They bring to the table a delivery process, which they're contractually obligated to work by, and it's not the same as having total discretion. So if you try and apply your vanilla service design process to those, you will absolutely fail. And I'll give an example of where we got that absolutely wrong as well in the beginning, because we thought we could do just as we were doing in dub, but we patently couldn't, because it didn't work for anyone. So it became well, and this wasn't something that became obvious to us in the beginning. When we had to really go through the hard school of knocks on this one. When we launched with our first iteration, we took a more simplistic product, but an important product for us, which is GST. We launched it to the market, and we were thinking, absolutely great, this is going to be awesome. Customers are going to love this, and that was not the case. I think when the GST product went out there, for your average SME user, it was a bit of a meh experience. Sort of great, new interface, new colors. Slightly different user model. But what we'd really missed was the fact that sort of a lot of GST filing and the management of GST for our products is done by intermediaries, tax agents. Nearly half of the sort of the filing submissions in this country come through tax agents who act on behalf of people, just because their tax situation is slightly more complex, and they want the assurance of working with a trusted party that can get it right for them. Tax agents are in our systems all the time. They absolutely hammer our systems. They're in this sort of multiple logons every day, and sort of just staying across their customer's position, but also working on behalf of the customer, submit data, and manage their position. When we launched the GST product, we absolutely missed the mark with the entire tax agent community, and they were quite rightly rather disturbed by the whole thing and provided feedback to that effect. And we had to go into a 3-month scramble where we had to sort of change a whole lot of things just to fit back into the working practices they'd established using the solution we'd previously deployed. And that was a real moment for us. We realized that sort of, despite having done what we thought was the groundwork about setting up this whole framework, we actually weren't incorporating the findings, learnings, and understandings into the teams. And the teams themselves were not curious enough about understanding our users and their real world situations. The data representing their usage patterns was not being pulled properly, and we had to remedy that. So I'd say one of the most positive things that happened to us in this whole program was actually getting it wrong in that very first release for such an important user community for us, and then having to work out how we adapted to that process. So over a period of 3 months, we reached out to the community, we engaged, we got into sort of co-design-like practices with them and bounced functions off to them, and then in three releases over 3 months, we just changed the things that were most irritating for them and got back on track. But it left us with a massive systemic learning that we'd done it wrong, basically. And we'd done it wrong because we assumed a whole lot of things and didn't really take the time to understand them properly. So where we got to that is like, okay, vanilla service design is not going to work for us. We've got to adapt to each channel, and each channel needs like a wrapper of quality assurance and development practices that's fit for purpose for that channel and its peculiarities. And we have to be really innovative in how we think about approaching things. So the innovation is not only in solutioning, the innovation comes very much in your deciding on an approach and in how you work. And there's a school of thinking around innovation, which is the school of the adjacent possible. It's based on the notion that sort of innovation is not these massive like shape-shifting changes where you're over here one moment and the next you're over there. It's actually a notion that if you take a number of adjacent steps that are different to your competitors or the likes, you actually get yourself in a position which is non-replicable. And it's actually the way in which most innovation takes place is through the world of the adjacent possible. And it's exactly that mentality that we've had to foster within our teams. That like, you're doing something now, what's the next best step you could do? How would you adapt this practice and make it one step better? And you just push on that for a while, and suddenly you've got a process that actually works really well for you. And you've shifted from a position which was quite poor as a starting point. So we got to a position at the end of the day when, for us, the world was just different across each of these channels, fundamentally different, and all our notions about vanilla service design were just absolutely out the window, basically. So just to illustrate that point a bit more, sorry, this looks pretty waterfall-y, but in fact all these processes are quite iterative. So the dub process, more vanilla. If you look at the set of practices there, the customer design validation, the guerrilla testing, the beta approach, it's what you'd see in the development of any major website. I suppose the more interesting part is actually the authenticated web channel, MyIR. Now, the provider we've got there, an American company called Fast. Fast is really fast. This is a company that I'd say they use a program methodology which is most akin to extreme programming. Back in the 80s and 90s, some of you guys might have seen that, but Barry Boom, I think it was, that sort of came with that. And it's basically you give lightweight specs to a development team, they churn through it and they throw it back for validation. You tell them it's wrong, you send it back to them, they churn again and again and again. In the end, it's roughly right, and you start pushing it to higher order testing, which is what we call business system testing, where we put business users in front of it, and then you sort of take it up the pipeline. And all the time, there's all these functional points that are just churning and churning and churning in the background. The thing is, though, while they work like that, they are absolute fascists when it comes to adherence to plan. So if you've got a functional blob you're trying to deal with, you've got to get it done by that date. And it's essentially in that program methodology that you have these hard stops and these functional blobs. So for us, when we really had to adapt to that, because those guys, they don't wait for you. You haven't got your input in time, it's not there. And they're going to do their churn thing, and they're going to spit code out, and that functional blob's complete, and they move on. And you've got this happening across multiple teams in parallel. And we had real challenges trying to work out how we could run ahead of them fast enough to actually provide qualified input to make design good. Because if it wasn't there, it wasn't there, and you got a very cookie cutter sort of like piece of functionality which probably wasn't going to hit the mark. So we tried an approach called customer design validation first. And this was off the back of the tax agent thing. I said, well, we've got to do this differently. Let's engage with an agency. Let's do some prototyping. And let's make sure that we sort of do it sufficiently far ahead of these guys to actually make sure that sort of the subject matter experts working in these teams have got this awesome sort of design base that they can push into the solution. And we spun it up at what we thought was pretty okay scale, sort of like across the pre and post build sort of validation, 200 participants, which we thought was okay. The problem was it just didn't work. The way we approached the prototyping was unconstrained, when the system we were trying to develop is actually quite constrained with a set of known design patterns and a design library. So we generated this enormous amount of input about how the world could be, but it was sort of about how the world could be if we didn't have a COTS system, which we did have. And at the end of the day, that vast body of recommendations, 600 plus recommendations around solution improvement and changes to the design pattern library, we only managed to get about 30% of that stuff through the door. We were too late, it was too big, it was too expansive, it was too greenfields, and basically it just wasn't fit for purpose for a COTS application, and it wasn't fit for purpose for the extreme programming approach they used. And we realized very quickly that we just could not do that again. It was very costly as well. A lot of the customer tests and the prototyping was done in lab-like environments, and getting people there was time-consuming. Us staffing up for that was time-consuming and expensive as well. So I'd say this was the approach we used for our biggest release, which was release 3, tax on income. And I think, sort of, while we got some good input, the input that we got was too much and a bit too late in many cases, and sort of that's reflected in the end solution as well. What we then moved on to was something different, which we're calling customer interaction testing. And weirdly enough, this is using a number of testing patterns that weren't developed in sort of the B2C space, but were developed in the B2B space. The way this company works is they, in order to be able to validate the code they're developing, they have to convert the data really early. So you can imagine that sort of, you're taking the data from your old legacy source system, you're putting it through a whole lot of conversion rules, and then you get a new data set that will be applied in the new reality. So as you're developing new code, you've got to have new data, otherwise you just can't really test anything. So they create massive data slices of converted data. Now, in the B2B world, this was essential. Because you've got all these parties integrating with us, and they need access to that data to do the testing of their solutions. But we realized with the help of the partners that were working with us on this front that actually you could make that partnership testing of one, basically. You could create a customer data slice of one person of converted data, and you could push a functional blob of code out to that customer, and they could log in effect in a beta-like way. They'd have access to the real MyR, and they'd have access to a beta or trial MyR. And in that, they'd get in there, they'd recognize the world immediately, because, hey, it's my data. Just, it looks slightly different, but it's still my data. And then we then asked them, using a survey-based methodology, to complete a task, basically. And then they rated us on their ability to complete that task. Well, we could see their ability to complete the task, so that was the easier bit. But they rated us on the efforts associated with that, the sentiments, and gave us general feedback on the solution as well. And what we managed to do in the last release was actually push this testing out to go from those more moderate numbers of 200 people. We got nearly 1,000 people that we ran through different functional areas here. And we chose around about half of our sort of higher level use cases as being more complex and pushed it out there. And that meant that in real time, while this machine was still churning in the background, we could actually push functional blobs out to customers for some real world validation using real world data and get real world feedback that we could accommodate for in the design. And suddenly our efficiency of design, and most importantly, the efficiency of customer-centric design was radically changed through this process. So this is a practice this is part of our backbone now. We'll be applying in this release. We want it to survive the program and move into BAU as well, because it's efficient and it's invaluable from the design process in a way. The next area I'd like to touch on is just the B2B space. I mentioned the ecosystem and our reliance on integrated partners. We have nearly we have in excess of 200 parties that we're integrated with in different ways. And that number is growing all the time. We've changed our interfaces from what were primarily point-to-point interfaces to generic, lightweight APIs at the moment. And that's all part of us actually opening ourselves up to the ecosystem and realizing that if you've got point-to-point interfaces, they're not really going to take you anywhere. So you've got to look at the generics. So what are the set of services that we can expose that will allow people who have access or should have access to customers' data to access that, so the customer details themselves, their income profile, their payments due, those are all separate services in a generic service portfolio. And in addition to those, we have other interfaces with suppliers such as the banks, the debt collection agencies overseas, etc. So the approach in this space is a very different one. Co-design is fundamentally different. The best example perhaps is the work that we had to do with the 15 KiwiSaver scheme providers when we need to redesign our interfaces for them. The lead times are enormous on getting an entire sector of the ecosystem to shift. So fully a year and a half before we went live with the KiwiSaver release, we were engaging with the community, preparing them for co-design. We then ran a series of 8 workshops, 5 looking at sort of outcomes and sort of requirements, and we used the lean canvas methodology to do that. Not because it's perhaps the best one we could use, but because we really liked the outcome focus in lean canvas, and it kept us away from solutioning. And once we'd gone through the requirement space, we then flicked onto the solutioning space as the very last thing. The process that we've got in place and that has been evolved over time, and this has gone through a massive evolution, is one where the testing and evolution of our services has become completely integrated with the onboarding of partners to those services. So we use test-driven developments. An integral part of us specifying services or specifying the set of test cases that define whether the service is working or not. And those test cases are developed in conjunction with the code themselves as standard sort of test harnesses, but they then flow through to the build packs and the specifications that we share with people sort of seeking to integrate with us. And furthermore, when you get into sort of the testing process with us, those use cases are there and supported by a set of stubbed-up interfaces in the most simple set of environments, accompanied in the more complex environments by sliced data that once again is a copy of the future world, the migrated data that's available, or alternatively, a slice of data that's particularly tailored to the generic test cases that we've got out there. And in that way, we've managed to sort of like pull together, if you'd like, everything from the co-design process through to a test-driven process, which facilitates sort of at-scale onboarding. The reason this has been so absolutely important for us is the scale as well. We have in the onboarding pipeline at the moment, using what has become a self-service methodology for us. We're working with 50 different parties at the moment who are integrating with different services across our suite. We've got a team internally of just 6 or 7 people running that entire process, and the whole process is based on self-certification, based on a set of known test cases that flow right through from co-design all the way through to onboarding, and also beyond into BAU as well. So if you look at this process and you compare it to the Maya one, another one that's fundamentally different, it's taken us 2-3 years to get this right, and to get the environments to match with the practice, to match with the assets has been quite a job. But once again, we think we've got to a point now where the practices are settling down, we've got the efficiency we need, and we can really, really push hard on this in a way. Just in closing, I think a few points here, and I suppose maybe a summary of some of the hard lessons that we've learned throughout this process. Firstly, is like outside-in thinking, and even using the term outside-in thinking is essential. It's like, it's good to give a team a handy phrase to help them challenge assumptions constructively rather than saying, no, you're wrong. But it's asking the question, are you really thinking about this from an outside-in perspective and not an inside-out perspective really helps, actually. I've mentioned the importance of understanding customers' context and the investment you need to do up front in that. Another point I would like to emphasize is the importance of being data-driven. You have a lot of insight about your customers in their current behavioral patterns in the channels that you have right now. Really, really try and leverage that as best you can in the developments. And I know that's probably telling everyone how to suck eggs, basically, but I think for us, it's such a massive resource, but it proved to be such an untapped resource in a way. And we've really had to invest quite heavily in that respect, as well as generating insights from that data. I've mentioned the whole incremental approach and the notion of innovating on how you do things as well, and sort of this notion of the adjacent possible. The big thing there is giving people license to do that and making sure they've got the funding and the ability to do that, because if you're not giving them the time, you're not giving them the license, and they don't have the money to do anything different, it just ain't going to happen. Putting people on a continuous learning journey is great, but just arm them appropriately so they can actually do it, and arm the right people appropriately and empower them so they can really make long and sustainable change to the way we work and think about things. Maybe, sort of in summary, it was really hard to put like a summary statements in there, but I sort of, in thinking back about on the work that the teams have done and a lot of the partners that have helped us on this process as well, who deserve acknowledgement for that. Some of these practices have nearly been treated as a craft. There's a lot of ingenuity in how these things have been worked out. Like intelligent people taking on wicked or complex problems and coming up with super ingenious problems, leveraging great technology. And it is sort of a craft in a way. But at the same time, what's made it worthwhile for us and valuable for us is that it's been applied a world of hard constraints. It's not a hobby project in a basement. There's a big release which has come every year, or sort of every 2 weeks in the areas where we've got sprints running. And you just have to deal with the constraints and the pressure of that world, and your practices have to work in that world. And the big trap, I think, with some of the sort of customer-centric design is actually allowing it to become sort of a religion unto itself and a law unto itself, and not keeping it sort of in check, if you'd like, with these hard delivery constraints, and making sure it delivers value all the time, and that every dollar spent there actually gives more value to the organization and to the customers. So yeah, I think that was pretty much it. I'm tuning into your question time. My apologies for that. So I think I better stop now. But yeah, so happy to take any questions from you guys.
Thanks, Rogan. I'm sure we can all agree that's a massive program of work with many, many stakeholders and interfaces. So I'm sure it's been a challenging time for you and the team. A few questions for you. There was one from Jason Hoseason, who I think is a tax agent. And he put that question in early. I would like to think you've dealt with that and acknowledged that there was an issue there and learned from it. So I'm going to skip past that.
I can say briefly that sort of like you can always do better, and I think for all our users out there as well, sort of these processes that we've got in play at the moment allow us to do better over time. But I won't in any way say that we're perfect. I would never ever state that. So Jason, wherever Jason is, yeah, we'll carry on making it better.
What else we got here? From Sean Ryan. Do you benchmark yourselves against other countries? And I'm going to interpret that to mean, does the IRD benchmark its digital transformation practices against other jurisdictions?
Yeah, we do. Actually, the OECD tax group that we're a part of runs a number of benchmarking exercises, and we find them quite adequate for our purposes. We rate well, and we're rating better. But interesting enough, I think New Zealand rates really well on two things which do go hand in hand. One is our digital capability, and secondly is the simplicity of the tax system. You find there's a strong correlation between those two. Countries with high complexity in their tax systems typically have low digital versatility, because it's just so hard to do it right digitally if it's complex.
And one from Dan Fowley. Where are you, Dan? The government is often, or various government agencies are often criticised for using overseas consulting companies to do the big jobs. Have innovative Kiwi firms been able to be a part of this transformation, or has it all been offshored?
Oh, no. So I think that's a really interesting point. I think the core system replacement has been done by Fast Enterprises, an American-based company. Interestingly enough, if you look at the origins of that company, it was actually started by some what were then Arthur Andersen consultants who implemented the original system in Inland Revenue nearly 20 years ago. So sort of deep knowledge of the system there. But if you look at the mix of the nearly 900 or so people working across the transformation program, it is truly varied. There's a lot of contractors in. The tax agency's been very focused on trying to find the best players both in government and in private sector that can contribute to the transformational journey. There's a lot of local firms engaged as well. Both large and small players have been pulled into the mix. And some of the greatest innovation that we've seen in how we do things has been driven by local firms. I think there's a lot of Q ingenuity and sort of like and some pragmatism which has helped us develop these practices and get good outcomes. So kudos to all local partners. And then of course we have had some of the bigger players in. We've had Accenture and the likes in as well, doing work for us. But I think it's the mix that has been good. It's been the mix of big offshore players, sort of really innovative local thinkers, and sort of a contractor base which is really varied. That's been combined with this core of business knowledge within Inland Revenue, and that mix has panned out really well for us.
And maybe last one, how did you manage to get an integration environment operating, given there's so many interfaces, assuming that you have multiple steps that data needs to make? How did you go about integration testing for such a beast?
Yeah. I mean, we're fortunate there. So the way those environments work is they're sort of on demand in AWS, basically. So part of, in fact, one of the legs of transformation I didn't mention is the whole conversion to cloud as well. So there's been a massive push within Inland Revenue to get off sort of like proprietary stacks and into the cloud, basically. So these integration environments, the way they work is that we can spin them up and drop them on demand, basically. So if I'm an integration partner and I want to sort of go through testing within Inland Revenue as part of onboarding. Basically, we commission an environment for you. We spin it up. It's your environment. We put a slice of data in there, and then you've got the stubbed services. Well, no, you've got the full services available for you to test against. So you can actually run your interface against our interfaces against a data set that's held in core functionality, in fact, in an instance of our core system, which is there just for you. So that's the way it works. So we basically spin up multiple instances of our core system and the associated interfaces and the associated data for each of the parties that is working with us, and that would be completely impossible without cloud. So we do all that on AWS. So those are the more advanced ones. We also have sort of, it's just a testing life cycle. I wouldn't say they're more advanced. Prior to that, we have another environment which has got stubbed interfaces, which is critical service testing, allowing the basic composition of the services to be testing, and that's a multi-party environment. But even there, sort of parties can sort of they've got quite a lot of flexibility in sort of managing the stubbed environments to fit with their testing processes. So.
And I think we're going to call it there. Thank you, Rogan, for coming down from Wellington and spending a bit of time with us.
My pleasure.
Cheers.
Great meeting you.